Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The Scottish Highlands stretched endlessly before us as our rental car wound through the narrow mountain roads. I pressed my face against the cool window, watching the imposing peaks shrouded in gray mist. Our annual family vacation to the remote lodge had become a tradition I'd grown to cherish, though this year felt different somehow. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive than I remembered. Our lodge sat nestled among a cluster of similar wooden structures, all owned by the same hospitality company that operated the Grand Hotel just a 10-minute walk through the pine-scented trails. The building itself was substantial, 2 stories of dark timber with large windows that reflected the surrounding forest like watchful eyes. My parents had been coming here since before I was born, drawn by the isolation and the luxury amenities of the nearby hotel. My family consisted of my parents, my Aunt Beverly, who joined us this year after her recent divorce, my 16-year-old sister Iris with her constant phone addiction, and my 10-year-old sister Lucy, who still believed in monsters under the bed. At 18, I felt responsible for watching over them all, a burden that weighed heavier as we unpacked our belongings in the eerily quiet surroundings. The other lodges appeared mostly empty, their windows dark and lifeless. Only 3 or 4 showed signs of occupation, flickering television screens casting blue shadows against drawn curtains, the occasional silhouette moving past a window. The isolation that usually comforted me now felt ominous, as if we were being watched by unseen eyes from the dense forest that pressed against the backs of all the buildings. That first evening, as I stood on our wooden deck breathing in the crisp mountain air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest seemed to pulse with hidden life, branches creaking and swaying despite the absence of wind. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures were strangely muted, as if nature itself was holding back, waiting for something terrible to unfold. The hotel's indoor pool had always been our daily ritual, a luxurious heated oasis that made the Scottish chill bearable. The facility was impressive, Olympic-sized with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountain vista, surrounded by pristine white tiles that echoed every sound. We'd established our routine over the years: morning swim, afternoon lounging, evening return to the lodge. On our 4th day, everything changed. The moment we entered the pool area, I noticed him. A man in his early 30s with an athletic build and pale skin that suggested he spent more time indoors than his physique implied. He wore expensive-looking goggles that completely obscured his eyes, making it impossible to tell where he was looking. But I felt his attention on us immediately, a crawling sensation across my skin that made me want to leave. His swimming pattern was bizarre. Instead of doing proper laps, he would dive underwater and remain submerged for unnaturally long periods. When he surfaced, he would be in completely different locations around the pool, always closer to where our family had positioned ourselves. The water distorted his movements beneath the surface, creating ghostly ripples that seemed to follow us wherever we moved. My mother noticed it first. She had a 6th sense about dangerous situations, honed by years of protecting her children. Without saying a word, she caught my eye and gave the subtle signal we'd developed over the years, a slight tilt of her head that meant stay alert and be ready to leave. But her warning came too late. The man was already underwater again, swimming directly beneath us. I watched in growing horror as his distorted form passed under Lucy, then Iris, then myself. He moved with predatory precision, taking his time, studying us from below like a shark circling prey. His presence felt invasive, violating, as if he were mentally photographing us for some unspeakable purpose. The chlorinated water suddenly felt contaminated, poisoned by his intrusion. When he surfaced just meters away from Iris, water streaming from his goggles in a way that made his face appear skeletal, my mother made the decision. We're leaving, now. Her voice carried an urgency that brooked no argument. We climbed out quickly, our wet feet slapping against the cold tiles as we headed for the changing rooms, all of us acutely aware of the man's continued presence in the pool behind us. The men's changing room reeked of industrial disinfectant and damp concrete, a sterile smell that couldn't quite mask something else underneath, something organic and unpleasant. I was alone, my father having finished changing and left already, when I heard the heavy door creak open behind me. My heart hammered against my ribs as footsteps echoed off the wet tiles, deliberate and measured. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. The same presence I'd felt in the pool was now confined in this small, windowless space with me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to continue dressing, my fingers trembling as I struggled with my shirt buttons. The footsteps stopped directly behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing, slow, controlled, watching. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could feel his eyes boring into my back, studying me with the same predatory focus he'd shown in the pool. My hands shook as I grabbed my wet swimming clothes and shoved them into my bag. When I finally worked up the courage to glance in the fogged mirror mounted on the wall, I caught a glimpse of his reflection, still wearing those impenetrable goggles, his mouth curved in what might have been a smile. I left without looking back, pushing through the door with such force it slammed against the wall. Outside, my family was clustered together near the hotel entrance, their faces tight with concern. "He followed you in there, didn't he?" my mother asked, though her expression said she already knew the answer. The violation felt complete. He'd marked us somehow, claimed us as his target. Lucy announced she needed the bathroom, and we all started walking toward the ladies' restroom near the hotel lobby. But as we approached, our collective breath caught. There he was again, the same man from the pool and changing room, loitering near the entrance to the women's facilities. He wasn't trying to hide his presence. If anything, he seemed to want us to see him there, to understand that nowhere was safe from his attention. My mother's protective instincts kicked in immediately. "I'm going with you," she told Lucy, taking her hand firmly. As they disappeared inside, the rest of us waited in the corridor, my Aunt Beverly wrapping her arms around Iris protectively. The man made no attempt to leave or even look away from us. He simply stood there, motionless and patient, like a predator confident in its eventual success. When my mother and Lucy emerged from the bathroom, my mother's face was ashen. "There was a woman in there," she whispered urgently as we huddled together. "Middle-aged, maybe 45. She came in right after us and went into a stall, but left the door wide open. Just stood there staring at me for the longest time before finally closing the door. Something's very wrong here. We need to get back to the lodge immediately." The walk back to our lodge usually took about 8 minutes through the winding forest path. A pleasant stroll we'd made countless times over the years. But today, every step felt measured and watched. The canopy above filtered the late afternoon light into strange shifting patterns that played tricks on our peripheral vision. Branches seemed to move when we weren't looking directly at them, and the usual birdsong was conspicuously absent. We were barely 50 meters from the hotel when I spotted her. The woman from the bathroom was following us, maintaining a distance of maybe 30 feet, close enough that we could see her clearly but far enough to maintain the pretense that our paths just happened to coincide. She was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair pulled back severely, and clothes that looked expensive but practical, the kind of outfit someone might wear for hiking or hunting. Her gait was wrong. She didn't walk like someone out for a casual stroll or even someone trying to get somewhere specific. Her movements were deliberate and predatory, each step placed carefully and quietly. She kept her head up, scanning the area constantly, but her attention always returned to us. It was the focused attention of someone tracking prey, calculating distances and opportunities. "Don't look back," my father whispered, but it was impossible not to. Every few seconds, one of us would glance over our shoulder to find her still there, matching our pace exactly. When we slowed down, she slowed down. When we picked up speed, she adjusted accordingly. There was no pretense anymore. She was hunting us, and she wanted us to know it. The forest path forked in several directions, offering multiple routes back to the lodge area. In previous years, we'd enjoyed exploring these different trails, discovering scenic viewpoints and hidden clearings. Now, each junction felt like a trap. We chose the most direct route home, hoping to minimize our exposure, but she seemed to know the trail system as well as we did. At one point, she disappeared entirely. For maybe 2 minutes, we thought we'd lost her, walking faster and breathing a bit easier. Then Iris spotted her again. She had taken a parallel path and was now ahead of us, emerging from a side trail that would put her between us and the lodge. The tactical nature of her movement was chilling. This wasn't random stalking. It was a coordinated hunt. By the time we reached the cluster of lodges, our nerves were completely frayed. We could see our building, Lodge number 7, just ahead, its familiar wooden facade offering the promise of locks and walls between us and whatever these people wanted. But as we approached our front door, fumbling for keys with shaking hands, we realized she was still out there, still watching, still waiting. From the safety of our lodge's front window, we watched the woman with growing dread. She didn't leave when we disappeared inside. Instead, she began what could only be described as reconnaissance. Moving with disturbing purpose, she walked between the lodges in a systematic pattern, pausing at windows, testing door handles, studying the layout of each building like she was memorizing architectural details. The other lodges showed no signs that their occupants were aware of her presence. Curtains remained drawn, doors stayed closed, the normal sounds of vacation life, television, conversation, children playing, continued undisturbed. We seemed to be the only ones who had noticed this predatory survey of the premises, which made the situation feel even more isolated and hopeless. After maybe 20 minutes of this methodical inspection, she stopped directly in front of Lodge number 6, the one immediately next to ours. For a long moment she simply stood there, head tilted slightly as if listening for something. Then she walked around to the back of the building, disappearing from our view but not from our thoughts. The knowledge that she was so close, separated from us by maybe 30 feet and some wooden walls, made my skin crawl. When she reappeared, she was walking straight toward the forest that bordered all the lodges on their rear sides. The tree line was dense and dark, a wall of pine and birch that stretched for miles into the highland wilderness. In all our years of coming here, none of us had ever seen anyone enter those woods. There were no marked trails, no signs indicating they were open to guests, and something about the forest itself seemed to discourage exploration. But she walked into the trees without hesitation, as if she knew exactly where she was going. Within moments, the shadows swallowed her completely, leaving only the gentle swaying of branches to mark her passage. The forest seemed to close behind her like a curtain, and suddenly the woods felt alive with hidden presence. Every shadow could be concealing watchers. Every rustling branch could mark someone moving through the undergrowth. "Where did she go?" Lucy asked, pressing her face against the window. Why did she go in there? None of us had answers, but we all felt the same creeping certainty that she hadn't gone far. She was still out there, somewhere in that maze of trees directly behind our lodge, probably watching us through the windows we couldn't see from inside. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows that made the forest even more impenetrable. Soon it would be completely dark, and we'd have no way of knowing where she was or what she was planning. The woods that had always seemed like a natural barrier, protecting the lodges from whatever lay beyond, now felt like a hiding place for predators who knew the terrain better than we did. Night fell over the lodge like a suffocating blanket, bringing with it a silence that felt unnatural and oppressive. We'd eaten dinner in tense quiet, jumping at every small sound. The settling of the wooden structure, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant hoot of an owl. By 9 o'clock we were all exhausted from the constant state of alertness, but none of us wanted to go to bed. Iris had been the first to retreat to her room, claiming she needed to charge her phone and maybe try to get some sleep. Her bedroom was on the second floor, facing the back of the lodge where the forest pressed closest to the building. The windows were large, designed to let in maximum natural light during the day, but at night they became dark mirrors that could hide anything lurking outside. We were settled in the main living area, clustered around the television but not really watching, when the knocking started. It wasn't the polite rap of someone at the front door. This was something else entirely. Heavy, deliberate blows against glass that seemed to echo through the entire structure. The sound was wrong, too loud and too forceful for human knuckles. Iris appeared at the top of the stairs within seconds, her face white with terror. "Someone's outside my window," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They're knocking on the glass really hard." The knocking continued as she spoke, a rhythmic pounding that seemed designed to shatter more than just windows. It was meant to shatter our sense of safety, our belief that walls and locks could protect us. I followed her upstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs with each step. Her room was at the far end of the hallway, and with every step closer, the knocking grew louder and more insistent. By the time I reached her doorway, the sound was deafening, like someone taking a sledgehammer to the glass. But when I looked at the windows, they showed no signs of damage, no cracks or stress marks that should have resulted from such violent impacts. "Open the curtains," I told myself, though every instinct screamed against it. My hands trembled as I grasped the heavy fabric, knowing that whatever was out there was probably waiting for exactly this moment. When I finally pulled the curtains aside, the darkness beyond was absolute. The security lights that normally illuminated the rear of the lodge were either broken or blocked, leaving only an impenetrable wall of black that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. But I could feel something out there, a presence pressing against the glass, close enough to touch if not for the barrier between us. The knocking had stopped the moment I opened the curtains, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. Whatever was outside knew we were looking now, knew we were aware of its presence, and that knowledge seemed to satisfy it in some horrible way. The rest of the family had gathered behind me, clustering in the doorway like frightened animals. "What do you see?" my father whispered, but I couldn't answer because I wasn't sure I was seeing anything at all. Just darkness, so complete it seemed solid, and the terrible certainty that something in that darkness was looking back at us. My father and I armed ourselves with the most powerful flashlights we could find, heavy-duty LED units meant for camping that could cut through the highland darkness like searchlights. The moment we stepped outside, the night air hit us with a sharp coldness that seemed to seep through our clothes and settle in our bones. Every breath created clouds of vapor that obscured our vision and made us feel even more vulnerable. The beam of my flashlight swept across the area beneath Iris's window, illuminating patches of disturbed earth and compressed grass that definitely hadn't been there that morning. But it was my Aunt Beverly who made the discovery that turned our concern into genuine terror. "Over here," she called from about 20 feet away, her voice tight with fear. "You need to see this." In the soft earth near the tree line, our flashlight beams revealed two distinct sets of footprints. One set was clearly made by hiking boots with aggressive tread patterns, the kind of footwear someone would choose for navigating rough terrain. The other set was smaller, made by what looked like running shoes, but both sets showed the same purposeful stride pattern. These weren't the wandering tracks of lost hikers or casual walkers. They were the deliberate paths of people who knew exactly where they were going. The prints led away from our lodge in a straight line toward the forest, disappearing into the undergrowth where the ground became too hard and root-tangled to hold impressions. But their direction was clear. Whoever had made these tracks had approached our building from the woods, spent time directly beneath Iris's window, and then retreated back into the darkness from which they'd come. As we stood there studying the evidence, lights began flickering on in the other lodges. First one window, then another, until nearly every occupied building in the cluster showed signs of awakened inhabitants. People were opening curtains, stepping onto porches, scanning the area with their own flashlights. Whatever was happening wasn't isolated to our family anymore. The entire community of guests had been disturbed by something. The sound that cut through the night air next made us all freeze in terror, the deep rhythmic thrum of helicopter rotors approaching fast and low. Within minutes, a police helicopter appeared over the tree line, its powerful searchlight sweeping back and forth across the lodge area in methodical patterns. The aircraft circled repeatedly, focusing its attention on the forest behind the buildings and occasionally hovering in place as if the crew had spotted something of interest. "They're looking for someone," my father said, stating the obvious but somehow making it feel more real. This wasn't our imagination or paranoia. Law enforcement was actively hunting for dangerous individuals in our immediate vicinity. The helicopter's presence should have been reassuring, but instead it confirmed our worst fears. We weren't safe. We had never been safe. And whatever was out there in the woods was significant enough to warrant a police manhunt. We hurried back inside and secured every possible entry point, placing chairs against doors and checking window locks twice. My father found a large glass jar in the kitchen and balanced it precariously on top of the front door handle. A primitive but effective early warning system that would crash to the floor if anyone tried to force entry while we slept. Morning came with deceptive normalcy. Bright Scottish sunlight streaming through our windows and the cheerful sounds of birds returning to their usual routines. We had spent the night in shifts, someone always awake and watching, but nothing else had disturbed our fragile peace. The helicopter had departed sometime before dawn, leaving behind only the memory of its searchlights and the terrible questions about what it had been hunting. We were packing our belongings, eager to leave this place that had transformed from a beloved retreat into a source of nightmares, when the lodge cleaning service arrived. The housekeeper was a local woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who had been maintaining these properties for over a decade. She was typically cheerful and talkative, but today her face was grave with the weight of terrible news. "I'm afraid there's been an incident," she began, setting down her cleaning supplies with unusual care. "The family staying in Lodge number 6, The one right next to yours. They've been found dead. All three of them. A couple and their teenage daughter, visiting from Edinburgh. The words hit us like physical blows, confirming our worst fears while somehow making them infinitely worse. The details she shared made our blood freeze. The family had been discovered by another guest who noticed their rental car hadn't moved in 2 days and became concerned enough to call the management. When authorities entered the lodge, they found a scene of calculated brutality that suggested the killers had taken their time, drawn out the violence for reasons no sane person could understand. The police believe it was a man and woman working together. Mrs. Caldwell continued, her voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking too loudly might somehow summon the killers back. They'd been watching the lodges for days, studying the guests, choosing their target. Security cameras at the hotel caught footage of them casing different buildings, following families, learning routines. The description she provided matched our stalkers perfectly. The man with the goggles from the pool, the woman who had followed us through the forest. They hadn't been random criminals looking for an easy burglary. They had been hunters, selecting prey with the patience and precision of apex predators. The family in Lodge 6 had simply been unlucky enough to fit whatever criteria these monsters used to choose their victims. But why kill them? My mother asked, though her voice suggested she didn't really want to know the answer. If it was just a robbery, why the violence? Mrs. Caldwell's expression grew even darker, if that was possible. The police don't think robbery was the primary motive, she said. Nothing valuable was taken. The killing was the point. They enjoyed it. As we loaded our car and prepared to leave, I couldn't stop thinking about proximity and luck. Lodge 6 was maybe 30 feet from Lodge 7. If the killers had chosen to go left instead of right when they approached the building cluster, if they had decided our family looked more vulnerable than the other one, if any of a dozen small variables had been different, we would have been the ones discovered by concerned neighbors. The drive home was conducted in shell-shocked silence, each of us lost in thoughts too dark to share. The Highland Mountains that had seemed so majestic on our arrival now appeared threatening, full of hidden spaces where predators could watch and plan, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. Even now, months later, I wake up sometimes thinking about those woods behind the lodge, wondering if the killers are still out there, still hunting, still choosing their next victims with the same methodical patience they had used on us. We never went back to Scotland. Some places, once poisoned by terror, can never be reclaimed. But sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I still hear the sound of knocking on glass and wonder if we were ever really as safe as we believed. I'll begin by saying that for context, my family was never particularly religious when I grew up, despite living smack dab in the middle of the South. We attended church sporadically, mainly for appearances rather than genuine worship. The most religious thing we'd ever done was being forced to attend a highly televised megachurch in my home city because my grandmother loved the social status it provided, not because she actually wanted to worship respectfully. She enjoyed being seen in the front rows, wearing her finest clothes, nodding along to sermons she never truly absorbed. The hypocrisy of it all became clear to me as I grew older, watching her gossip about fellow congregants in the church parking lot immediately after services ended. Our household operated on a foundation of conditional love and emotional manipulation. My parents wielded guilt like a weapon, their voices rising and falling in predictable patterns of anger and disappointment. Dinner conversations were minefields, where any wrong word could trigger hours of screaming matches. My father would slam his fist on the table, causing the dishes to jump and rattle, while my mother would retreat into icy silence that could last for days. The walls of our house seemed to absorb these toxic exchanges, creating an atmosphere thick with unresolved tension and resentment. I learned early to read the subtle signs of an approaching storm. The way my father's jaw tightened when he came home from work, the sharp edge in my mother's voice when she asked about my day, the way they moved around each other like opposing magnets. Their bedroom door would slam shut at night, and I would lie in my bed listening to their muffled arguments through thin walls, their words becoming an incomprehensible rumble of anger and accusation. School provided little refuge. I was an average student, neither excelling nor failing dramatically enough to draw attention. Teachers saw me as quiet and compliant, never realizing that my silence stemmed from the chaos I left behind each morning and would return to each afternoon. Friends were casual acquaintances at best. I never invited anyone over. terrified of what they might witness. The shame of my home life created a barrier between me and meaningful connections with peers. The weight of this isolation pressed down on me constantly. I developed habits of hypervigilance, always scanning rooms for exits, always preparing for the next emotional explosion. My stomach lived in a constant state of tension, churning with anxiety that manifested as frequent headaches and an inability to eat regular meals. I would hide in my room for hours, losing myself in books and music, anything to drown out the sound of my parents' deteriorating relationship. As I entered my early 20s, the dysfunction only intensified. My parents' expectations for my future became another battlefield, with career choices and life decisions scrutinized and criticized with brutal efficiency. Nothing I accomplished was ever quite enough, and every failure was dissected and analyzed until I felt like a specimen under a microscope. The emotional abuse was subtle but relentless, a constant drip of criticism disguised as concern, love offered with strings attached, approval dangled like a carrot I could never quite reach. This all took place around 3 years ago, during a particularly dark period in my life when everything seemed to be falling apart simultaneously. It was 2021, a time when my mental state and relationship with my parents had reached a breaking point. The arguments had escalated beyond typical family disagreements into something more sinister and damaging. Words were chosen specifically to wound, secrets weaponized, and trust systematically eroded until our home felt more like a war zone than a place of shelter. My mother had perfected the art of passive-aggressive warfare, delivering cutting remarks with a smile, and following them with "I'm just concerned about you, honey." My father preferred the direct approach, explosive outbursts that left everyone walking on eggshells for days afterward. The combination was toxic, creating an environment where I felt constantly under siege, never knowing which version of my parents I would encounter on any given day. But the breaking point came when I received a phone call that shattered what remained of my emotional stability. My friend James, someone I had known since high school and had recently begun dating, had taken his own life. The news hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and leaving me gasping on the kitchen floor where I had answered the phone. The caller's voice seemed to come from very far away, explaining details I couldn't process, offering condolences that felt meaningless against the magnitude of my shock. James had been struggling with depression, but he had hidden it well behind a facade of humor and optimism. We had spent the previous weekend together, laughing over dinner, making plans for a camping trip the following month. He had kissed me goodbye on Sunday evening, telling me he would call me soon. There had been no signs, no warnings, no indication that he was planning to end his life just 3 days later. The guilt consumed me immediately and completely. I replayed every conversation, searching for clues I had missed, signs I should have recognized. Had I been too self-absorbed with my own family problems to notice his pain? Could I have said something different, done something more? The questions tormented me, creating a spiral of self-blame that fed on itself, growing stronger with each passing hour. My parents' reaction to my grief was characteristically self-centered. My mother worried about how his death would reflect on our family, concerned that people might think we had somehow contributed to his depression. My father dismissed my tears as dramatic and suggested I should get over it quickly to avoid dwelling on negativity. Their inability to provide comfort during my darkest hour drove home the reality that I was truly alone in my suffering. The funeral was a nightmare of barely contained hysteria. I sat in the back row, watching James's family receive condolences from a steady stream of mourners, all of whom seemed to have stories about his kindness and humor. I wanted to scream at them all, to tell them how wrong they were, how they had failed him just as I had. Instead, I sat in silence, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my fingernails drew blood from my palms. After the service, I drove aimlessly for hours, eventually finding myself parked outside the restaurant where James and I had shared our last meal together. The building looked exactly the same, but the world felt fundamentally altered, as if the color had been drained from everything I could see. I sat in my car until well past midnight, crying until my eyes burned and my throat was raw from sobbing. In the weeks following James's funeral, my soul felt utterly dragged down with the weight of grief and guilt. The days blended together in a haze of barely suppressed anguish, and normal activities felt impossible to navigate. Eating became a chore that required tremendous effort, and even simple conversations with coworkers or acquaintances felt like elaborate performances where I pretended to be a functioning human being. Eventually, the grief began to manifest in my dreams. At first, they were relatively normal, Simple replays of memories with James, conversations we had shared, moments of laughter that now felt like mockery. But gradually, these dreams began to change, taking on a darker quality that left me feeling more exhausted upon waking than I had been when I went to sleep. The transformation started subtly. In dreams where I was reliving happy memories with James, shadows would begin to creep in around the edges of my vision. The bright restaurant where we had eaten dinner would slowly dim, the cheerful chatter of other diners fading to an ominous silence. James's voice would become distorted, his words echoing strangely as if spoken through water or from a great distance. Then came the universal element that would define all future nightmares, the progressive darkening that seemed to devour light itself. The room, or whatever setting I found myself in, would begin to lose illumination in a way that defied natural explanation. It wasn't like a sunset or the gradual dimming of electric lights. It was as if darkness itself was a living entity, actively consuming brightness and warmth and hope. All my dreams occurred in first-person perspective, making the experience intensely personal and terrifying. The dark haze would start at the periphery of my vision, like peripheral vision gradually failing, but far more menacing. It would creep inward with deliberate malevolence, and I could feel it approaching even when I couldn't see it directly. The sensation was similar to knowing someone was staring at you from behind, but magnified 100-fold. As the darkness encroached, I would begin to feel an indescribable dread welling up in my stomach. It started as a cold, heavy sensation, like swallowing ice water on an empty stomach, but it quickly evolved into something far worse. The feeling was accompanied by the absolute certainty that something terrible was about to happen, though I never knew what. My dream body would tense in preparation for an attack that hadn't yet materialized, every nerve-ending screaming warnings I couldn't heed. The most disturbing aspect was what happened to other people in these dreams. If there were people present when the darkness began its assault, friends, family members, strangers, they would either vanish completely or undergo a horrifying transformation. One moment they would be normal, speaking and moving naturally, and the next they would be gone as if they had never existed at all. Worse were the times when they didn't disappear. Instead, they would turn to face me with expressions completely devoid of life or emotion. Their eyes would become glassy and unfocused, their faces slack and empty. They would stand perfectly still, staring at me with those dead eyes, their mouths hanging slightly open as if they had forgotten how to close them. The sight was infinitely more terrifying than if they had simply vanished. But the worst part was yet to come. The feeling that would grip me as the darkness completed its conquest of my dream landscape. It began as an intensification of the pins and needles sensation you might experience when a limb falls asleep, but it quickly became something far more sinister. The sensation grew heavier and more oppressive, as if invisible hands were pressing down on my entire body with increasing force. This crushing feeling was accompanied by the most pure, concentrated terror I had ever experienced. It wasn't fear of a specific threat or danger. It was existential dread, the absolute certainty that I was in the presence of something that wished me the most profound harm imaginable. My dream self would try to scream, to run, to fight back, but I was completely powerless against whatever was attacking me. The paralysis was complete and absolute. I couldn't move my arms or legs, couldn't turn my head, couldn't even open my mouth to cry for help. It was as if my body had been encased in invisible concrete, leaving only my mind free to experience the full horror of my situation. The helplessness was almost as terrifying as the attack itself. As weeks passed, the dreams not only continued but intensified in both frequency and violence. What had begun as occasional nightmares became a nightly ordeal that I dreaded with every passing hour of daylight. The knowledge that sunset would eventually arrive filled me with a growing panic that made it difficult to concentrate on even the simplest daily tasks. The sound element became more prominent and more disturbing. Along with the crushing sensation and the visual darkness, I began to hear what could only be described as a combination of television static and the deafening song of cicadas, but amplified beyond any natural level. The noise would start as a barely perceptible whisper, like tuning into a radio station just slightly off frequency, but it would quickly build to an overwhelming roar that seemed to originate from inside my own skull. This auditory assault made it impossible to think clearly or form coherent thoughts. Any attempt to pray, to call for help, or even to understand what was happening to me, was drowned out by the relentless electronic screaming. It was as if the sound was specifically designed to prevent me from accessing any mental resources that might help me fight back or escape. The physical sensations also evolved. becoming more specific and more terrifying. Instead of just the general crushing feeling, I began to experience what felt like actual hands grabbing me, their grip cold and impossibly strong. These phantom hands would focus on different parts of my body, sometimes wrapping around my wrists and ankles to hold me in place, other times encircling my throat with gradually increasing pressure. The strangling sensation was particularly horrifying because it felt completely real. I could feel individual fingers pressing into the soft flesh of my neck, cutting off my air supply with surgical precision. My dream body would thrash and struggle, but the hands were immovable, maintaining their grip no matter how desperately I fought against them. I would wake up gasping and clawing at my throat, my hands searching for attackers that weren't there. Sleep became an enemy to be avoided at all costs. I developed elaborate rituals designed to postpone the inevitable, staying up until exhaustion made consciousness impossible, drinking excessive amounts of caffeine, engaging in any activity that might keep my mind occupied. But eventually, my body would surrender to its need for rest, and the nightmares would claim me once again. The worst part was the consistency of the experience. Unlike normal dreams, which tend to be chaotic and unpredictable, these nightmares followed the same pattern every single time. The setting might change. Sometimes I would be in my childhood bedroom, other times in unfamiliar locations, but the sequence of events was always identical. Darkness, dread, paralysis, assault, and then the struggle to wake up. Even when I managed to force myself awake, the terror didn't end immediately. I would lie in bed for hours, afraid to close my eyes, afraid to move, afraid that the slightest relaxation of vigilance would allow the nightmare to resume exactly where it had left off. And often, that's exactly what would happen. If I fell back asleep too quickly, the dream would pick up in mid-attack, as if whatever was tormenting me had simply been waiting patiently for my return. The lack of quality sleep began to take a serious toll on my physical and mental health. My immune system weakened, leaving me susceptible to every minor illness that circulated through my workplace. My appetite disappeared almost entirely, and I lost significant weight in a very short period of time. Coworkers began to comment on my appearance, asking if I was feeling well, but I had no way to explain what was happening to me without sounding completely insane. My relationship with my parents deteriorated even further, as my behavior became more erratic and my tolerance for their emotional manipulation reached zero. I would snap at them over minor issues, my exhausted mind unable to maintain the careful diplomatic balance that had previously kept our household relatively peaceful. Their response was predictably self-centered. They accused me of being dramatic, of using my grief as an excuse for bad behavior, of being disrespectful and ungrateful. The breaking point came during a particularly vicious argument with my parents over my attitude problem. My father had cornered me in the kitchen, his face red with anger as he listed my various failures and shortcomings. My mother stood behind him, nodding in agreement and adding her own criticisms whenever he paused for breath. The noise of their voices combined with my severe sleep deprivation created a sensory overload that triggered something close to a panic attack. I found myself backing toward the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to process their words. But instead of their familiar voices, I began to hear that horrible static sound from my dreams, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. The kitchen lights seemed to dim, and for a terrifying moment I thought the nightmare was beginning to bleed into my waking life. Without a word of explanation or goodbye, I turned and ran to my room, throwing whatever belongings I could fit into 2 suitcases. My parents followed me, their voices reaching new levels of outrage as they demanded to know what I thought I was doing. But I couldn't respond coherently. All I knew was that I had to get out of that house immediately, before the darkness that haunted my dreams found a way to manifest in reality. I called my friend Bethany while sitting in my car in the driveway, my engine running and my few possessions piled in the back seat. Bethany was someone I had known since college, a deeply religious woman whose faith had always puzzled and slightly intimidated me. She lived alone in a small cabin about 2 hours away from the city, in an area so rural that GPS signals were unreliable and neighbors were measured in miles rather than feet. When I explained my situation, or at least the parts I could explain without sounding completely unhinged, Bethany didn't hesitate to offer me her spare room. She had always been generous and kind, but I sensed that her invitation came from something deeper than mere friendship. It was as if she recognized something in my voice, some quality of desperation that resonated with her own experiences. The drive to Bethany's cabin took me through increasingly isolated countryside, past farmland that stretched to the horizon and small towns that seemed frozen in time. With each mile I traveled away from the city, I felt some of the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The radio reception faded to static, then disappeared entirely, leaving me alone with my thoughts for the first time in weeks. Bethany's cabin was everything she had described and more. Nestled in a grove of ancient oak trees, the single-story structure looked like something from a fairy tale, with a wrap-around porch and flower boxes under every window. The interior was cozy but sparse, decorated with handmade quilts and wooden furniture that Bethany had crafted herself. The most prominent feature was a large wooden cross hanging above the fireplace, its simple design somehow conveying both strength and peace. The bedroom she offered me was actually a converted loft space, accessible by a narrow staircase and furnished with just a twin mattress, a small dresser, and a single window that looked out over the surrounding forest. The space was cramped but private, and for the first time in months I felt like I might be able to breathe normally again. Bethany respected my need for space and didn't press me for details about what had driven me from my family home. She prepared simple meals and invited me to join her, but didn't take offense when I sometimes preferred to eat alone. Her routine was structured around prayer and Bible study, activities she engaged in quietly and without fanfare. I found the rhythm of her daily life oddly comforting, even though I didn't understand or share her faith. For the first few nights in the cabin, I slept better than I had in weeks. The complete silence of the rural setting was initially unsettling. I had grown accustomed to the constant background noise of city life, but it gradually became soothing. The air was cleaner and cooler, and the absence of streetlights meant that true darkness fell with the sunset, a natural rhythm that my exhausted body gratefully embraced. But I should have known that the peace wouldn't last. Whatever had been tormenting me in my dreams wasn't tied to a specific location. It had found me wherever I was, and geographic distance wouldn't be enough to keep it at bay. I had simply delayed the inevitable confrontation, and when it finally came, the isolation that had initially felt protective would become a source of additional terror. The first few weeks at Bethany's cabin passed in a haze of recuperation and cautious optimism. My body slowly began to recover from the months of sleep deprivation and stress, and I found myself able to eat regular meals and engage in simple conversations without feeling completely overwhelmed. Bethany's gentle presence was like a balm to my frayed nerves, and her unwavering faith provided a sense of stability that I hadn't realized I was desperately craving. The cabin itself became a source of comfort and fascination. Built by Bethany's grandfather in the 1940s, it had been lovingly maintained and gradually modernized while preserving its rustic charm. The walls were lined with knotty pine that had aged to a warm golden color, and every room smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender from the sachets Bethany kept in the linen closets. The isolation that had initially seemed daunting began to feel like a blessing. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived alone with her collection of rescue cats, and her small farmhouse was barely visible through the trees, nearly half a mile away. The main road was even farther, and during the day the only sounds were natural ones: birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant lowing of cattle from a farm several miles down the valley. I established routines that helped anchor me to this new, peaceful existence. Each morning I would make coffee and sit on the front porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The beauty of these moments was almost overwhelming after the urban grayness I had left behind. I began to understand why Bethany had chosen this life of solitude and simplicity. My loft space became a sanctuary where I could read, write in a journal I had started keeping, or simply lie on the small bed and listen to the sounds of the forest. The single window provided a perfect frame for the changing seasons, and I found myself marking time by the subtle shifts in the color of leaves and the migration patterns of birds. Bethany and I developed an easy rhythm of coexistence. She would rise early for morning prayers, then tend to her small vegetable garden or work on various craft projects. I learned that she supported herself through an online business selling handmade soaps and candles, work that allowed her to maintain her chosen lifestyle of rural isolation. In the evenings, we would often sit together on the porch, sharing simple meals and comfortable conversation. It was during these evening talks that I began to open up about my nightmares, though I was careful to downplay the more disturbing aspects of my experiences. Bethany listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of sympathy. When I mentioned my complete lack of religious background, she didn't try to convert me or launch into theological discussions. Instead, she simply shared her own story of finding faith during a difficult period in her young adult life. Bethany's approach to religion was gentle and personal rather than evangelical. She prayed quietly before meals and spent time each day reading her well-worn Bible. But she never made me feel excluded or pressured to participate. Her faith seemed to provide her with a deep sense of peace and purpose that I envied, though I couldn't imagine ever achieving that kind of spiritual certainty myself. As the weeks passed, I began to believe that I had truly escaped the nightmares that had tormented me for so long. I was sleeping through the night regularly, waking refreshed and optimistic about the day ahead. The weight of grief over James's death was still present, but it had transformed from a crushing burden into a manageable sadness that no longer threatened to overwhelm me completely. I started making plans for the future. Perhaps I would stay in the area permanently, find work in one of the small towns nearby, build a life based on simplicity and peace rather than the constant stress and conflict I had known before. The idea of remaining close to Bethany and her stabilizing influence felt like the first genuinely positive decision I had made in years. But as the saying goes, pride comes before a fall. My growing confidence in my recovery was about to be shattered in the most terrifying way possible. The entity that had been haunting my dreams was far from finished with me, and my peaceful interlude at the cabin was about to end in a confrontation that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality and the power of evil. The night that everything changed started like any other. Bethany had gone to spend the evening at Mrs. Patterson's house, helping the elderly woman with some household repairs, and staying overnight to keep her company. This was a regular occurrence, part of Bethany's commitment to being a good neighbor and providing assistance to those who needed it. I had grown comfortable with these occasional nights alone in the cabin. The isolation that would have terrified me in my previous state now felt manageable and even enjoyable. I had planned to spend the evening reading, perhaps writing in my journal, and getting an early night's sleep. It had been over a month since my last nightmare, and I had begun to believe that chapter of my life was finally closed. How wrong I was. That particular evening began with an unusual sense of restlessness that I couldn't quite identify or shake. As sunset approached, I found myself pacing the small confines of the cabin, unable to settle down with a book or any other activity that normally brought me comfort. The forest outside seemed unusually quiet. Even the ever-present chorus of insects had fallen silent, creating an atmosphere of expectancy that made me increasingly nervous. I tried to dismiss these feelings as residual anxiety from my months of trauma, but some primal part of my brain was sending urgent warning signals that I couldn't ignore. The very air in the cabin felt different, charged with an electricity that made my skin feel tight and my nerves hypersensitive. Every small sound, the settling of the wooden frame, the whisper of wind through the eaves, seemed magnified and significant. As darkness fell, I forced myself to go through my normal bedtime routine, hoping that familiar actions would calm my growing unease. I brushed my teeth, changed into comfortable sleeping clothes, and climbed the narrow stairs to my loft space. The small room that had been my refuge for weeks suddenly felt confining and vulnerable, its single window now appearing as a potential point of entry for something I couldn't name. I lay down on the twin mattress and tried to focus on my breathing, using relaxation techniques I had learned years earlier during a brief experiment with meditation. But instead of bringing peace, the exercise only heightened my awareness of how alone I was, how far from help, how completely cut off from any possibility of rescue if something were to go wrong. Despite my anxiety, exhaustion eventually overcame my hypervigilance, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. But this time, there was no gradual transition into the nightmare state I had grown to dread. Instead, it was like being thrown into the deep end of a pool, sudden, shocking, and completely disorienting. In the dream, I found myself stumbling out of the cabin in a state of panic, my movements clumsy and desperate as I fumbled for my car keys. The familiar landscape of Bethany's property looked wrong somehow. The trees too tall, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The very ground beneath my feet soft and unreliable as if it might give way at any moment. I managed to reach my vehicle and threw myself behind the wheel, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely insert the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I pressed the accelerator to the floor, sending gravel flying as I tore down the narrow dirt road that led away from the cabin. The speedometer climbed to dangerous levels, but I couldn't make myself slow down. Some terrible urgency was driving me forward, though I had no idea where I was going or what I was fleeing from. In the dream, I was frantically trying to call Bethany on my cell phone, my fingers stabbing at the buttons as I tried to maintain control of the vehicle. When she finally answered, her voice was warm and concerned, asking what was wrong, why I sounded so frightened. I tried to explain that I was driving myself to the hospital, that something terrible was about to happen, but my words came out in a jumbled rush that probably made no sense. Then Bethany's voice began to change, the familiar warmth draining away and being replaced by something cold and malevolent. Her words became distorted, as if the phone connection was failing, but underneath the static, I could hear something else, a deep guttural growling that seemed to come from some impossible depth. The sound was definitely not coming through the phone. It was behind me, in the car, breathing down my neck with predatory patience. The darkness that had become my constant tormentor in dreams began its familiar assault. But this time it was more aggressive, more immediate. The headlights of my car cut out without warning, plunging the road ahead into absolute blackness. I frantically tried every switch and button on the dashboard, but nothing would bring the lights back. The speedometer was still showing dangerous speeds, but I could no longer see where I was going. My vision began to narrow as the supernatural darkness encroached from all sides, creating a tunnel effect that grew smaller and smaller with each passing second. The terror that gripped me was beyond anything I had experienced in previous nightmares. This wasn't just fear of the unknown, but the absolute certainty that I was about to be destroyed by something that had been hunting me for months. Then came the touch that changed everything. For the first time in any of my dreams, I felt physical contact that was unmistakably real and unmistakably hostile. A massive hand, far larger than any human hand could be, slid through my hair at the back of my head. The fingers were long enough that they could rest at the base of my skull while still reaching my forehead, and I could feel what could only be described as claws lightly scraping against my skin. The hand gathered a fistful of my hair and yanked my head back with brutal force, pressing me against the seat of the car with such violence that I could feel my neck straining at an impossible angle. The grip was iron strong and growing tighter, and I knew with horrible clarity that this thing, whatever it was, could snap my neck as easily as breaking a twig. The growling sound grew louder and more distinct, resolving into what might have been words in some language I didn't recognize. But even without understanding the specific meaning, the message was crystal clear. This entity hated me with a purity and intensity that was beyond human comprehension. Its hatred was absolute, focused, and deeply personal, as if my very existence was an affront that demanded punishment. The crushing sensation that had tormented me in previous dreams was magnified 100-fold. I felt as if I were being compressed from all directions by invisible forces. My chest constricted until each breath was a monumental struggle. My mouth opened in what should have been a scream, but no sound emerged. Even my voice had been stolen by this thing's power. In that moment of absolute helplessness, I remembered something Bethany had told me during one of our evening conversations. She had mentioned that when faced with spiritual attack, believers could call upon God to send protection, specifically mentioning Saint Michael and the Holy Spirit. At the time, I had listened politely but dismissed the idea as religious superstition. Now, with no other options available, I found myself crying out silently for help from a God I wasn't even sure I believed in. The prayer was desperate and completely sincere. I promised that if this entity could be driven away, if I could be saved from this torment, I would believe forever. I would dedicate my life to faith, to service, to whatever was required in exchange for rescue from this nightmare that had become my reality. The response was immediate and unmistakable. As soon as I called out to God, the grip on my hair began to loosen, slowly and reluctantly, as if the thing holding me was being forced to release its hold against its will. The crushing sensation around my chest eased, allowing me to draw deep, gasping breaths. The horrible growling faded to a whisper, then disappeared entirely. I woke up completely, sitting bolt upright in my small bed with my heart hammering against my ribs. But the terror didn't end with waking. If anything, it intensified, because I realized that the feeling of being watched, of being in the presence of something malevolent, was still there. The nightmare was over, but the threat was not. I sat frozen in my small bed, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to do anything that might draw attention to myself. The loft space was illuminated only by starlight filtering through the single window, creating a dim gray landscape of familiar furniture that now seemed alien and threatening. Every shadow could be hiding something. Every creak of the old cabin could be a footstep approaching my vulnerable position. Then I saw them, 2 points of red light visible through the window that faced the forest. At first, I tried to convince myself that they were some kind of reflectors, perhaps from a piece of farm equipment or a road sign, catching the moonlight in an unusual way. But as my eyes adjusted and focused, the horrible truth became undeniable. They were eyes. Enormous, malformed eyes that glowed with their own internal fire, staring directly at me through the glass. The entire eyeball was red. Not just the iris, but the whites as well, as if they were filled with blood rather than normal fluid. They were easily 3 times the size of human eyes, set in a head that I could barely make out in the darkness, but which appeared grotesquely oversized and misshapen. The geometry of the situation was all wrong. The loft window was on the 2nd story of the cabin, at least 12 feet off the ground, and there were no trees close enough to support something of human size. Whatever was looking at me had to be standing on the ground, which meant it was tall enough to peer over the windowsill with ease. Based on the angle of its gaze, I estimated that the thing had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall. We stared at each other for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Those red eyes showed no emotion, no malice, no satisfaction at having found me. They simply observed with the cold calculation of a predator studying its prey. There was intelligence behind them, but it was alien and hostile, completely devoid of anything I could recognize as mercy or compassion. With shaking hands, I reached for my cell phone, never taking my eyes off the window. My fingers fumbled with the device as I tried to navigate to Bethany's contact information, my fine motor control compromised by the adrenaline flooding my system. When I finally managed to place the call, she answered on the 2nd ring, immediately alert despite the late hour. "Something's here," I whispered into the phone, my voice barely audible even to myself. "It's outside my window watching me. I can see its eyes." Bethany didn't waste time asking for explanations or suggesting rational alternatives. The urgency in my voice must have conveyed the reality of my terror, because she immediately began organizing her response. She told me she was leaving Mrs. Patterson's house immediately and would be back at the cabin within 20 minutes. In the meantime, she instructed me to put the phone on speaker and not to hang up under any circumstances. As I placed the phone on the small dresser beside my bed, Bethany's voice filled the cramped loft space with prayers and scripture verses. She quoted passages about protection and deliverance, her voice strong and confident even coming through the tiny speaker. She instructed me to repeat certain phrases after her, words that felt foreign on my tongue but which seemed to carry weight and power beyond their simple meaning. Following Bethany's guidance, I found a small bundle of white sage that she had given me weeks earlier, explaining that it was traditionally used for cleansing spaces of negative energy. With trembling hands, I lit the dried herbs with a book of matches, filling the loft with sweet, pungent smoke. The familiar smell was comforting, and I found myself breathing more easily as the smoke drifted around the small space. Gradually, the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the cabin began to lift. The air felt lighter, less charged with malevolent electricity. When I finally worked up the courage to look toward the window again, the red eyes were gone, leaving only empty darkness beyond the glass. The sense of being watched, of being in immediate danger, faded until it was completely absent. By the time Bethany arrived at the cabin, her headlights cutting through the darkness as she pulled into the gravel driveway, the entire experience felt like it might have been an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But when she climbed the stairs to my loft and saw my face, she knew immediately that what I had experienced was real and significant. We spent the rest of the night talking, with Bethany sharing stories of her own encounters with spiritual warfare, and explaining the theological framework that helped her understand such experiences. She spoke about the reality of evil in the world, about the ongoing battle between forces of light and darkness, about the power available to those who called upon divine protection with genuine faith. For the first time in my life, these concepts didn't sound like abstract religious theory. They felt like practical information that could mean the difference between safety and destruction. I had experienced something that couldn't be explained by psychology or coincidence, and Bethany's faith-based understanding was the only framework that made sense of what had happened to me. In the days that followed, I began attending the small country church where Bethany worshipped, a simple white building that served a congregation of fewer than 50 people. The pastor was a kind, elderly man who had spent his entire career ministering to rural communities, and his sermons focused on practical applications of faith rather than complex theological arguments. I started reading the Bible, beginning with the Gospels, and gradually working my way through both the Old and New Testaments. The words that had once seemed archaic and irrelevant now carried personal meaning, especially passages dealing with protection from evil and the power of prayer. I developed my own evening prayer routine, specifically asking for protection through the night and expressing gratitude for my deliverance. The nightmares stopped completely. Not gradually, not with occasional relapses, but immediately and permanently. Whatever had been tormenting me for months seemed to understand that I was no longer an easy target, that I had found a source of protection it couldn't overcome. My sleep became peaceful and restorative, and I began to regain the physical and emotional strength that had been slowly drained away during my ordeal. My relationship with my parents remained difficult, but I found that I no longer needed their approval or validation to feel worthwhile. The spiritual foundation I was building provided a source of strength and identity that couldn't be shaken by their criticism or manipulation. I was able to establish boundaries and maintain them without feeling guilty or inadequate. 6 months later, I moved into my own apartment in a small town about 30 minutes from Bethany's cabin. It was a simple one-bedroom place above a local bakery, but it felt like a palace compared to the emotional chaos of my childhood home. I found work at the town's small library, a peaceful job that allowed me to help people while maintaining the quiet, contemplative lifestyle I had grown to value. Bethany and I remained close friends, meeting regularly for meals and conversation. Her influence on my life had been transformational, not because she had tried to convert me, but because she had shown me what genuine faith looked like in practice. Her peace, her strength, her unwavering conviction that good would ultimately triumph over evil, these qualities had given me a roadmap for building my own spiritual life. I still pray every night before going to sleep, a practice that has become as natural and necessary as brushing my teeth. The prayers aren't elaborate or formally structured, usually just a simple request for protection and an expression of gratitude for another day of safety and peace. But they serve as a reminder that I am not alone in the world, that there are forces of good that are stronger than any evil I might encounter. Some people might dismiss my story as a psychological breakdown followed by a religious awakening, and I understand their skepticism. Mental health is a serious issue, and I don't want to suggest that all emotional or psychological problems can be solved through faith alone. But I know what I experienced, and I know what ended that experience. When you're facing something that wishes you harm with an intensity that defies human understanding, you learn to recognize the difference between imaginary fears and genuine spiritual threat. The entity that tormented me was real, it was evil, and it was actively working to destroy my peace, my sanity, and potentially my life. Only when I called upon divine protection was I able to break free from its influence. My life now is simple but fulfilling. I work at the library, tend a small garden behind my apartment, participate in church activities, and maintain meaningful friendships with people who share my values. The dramatic trauma that drove me to Bethany's cabin feels like something that happened to a different person, though I carry the lessons I learned from that experience with me every day. I still miss James, and I probably always will. But the guilt and despair that once threatened to consume me have been replaced by a sense of purpose and hope. I believe that his death, while tragic, served as a catalyst that ultimately led me to discover spiritual resources I never knew existed. In some way, his loss contributed to my salvation, and I honor his memory by living the kind of life he would have wanted for me. The most important lesson I learned is that evil is real, but it is not the strongest force in the universe. When confronted with genuine malevolence, we are not powerless. There are sources of help available to those who ask with sincere faith. The protection I found didn't come from my own strength or cleverness, but from a divine power that responds to genuine cries for help. That knowledge has given me a confidence and peace that no amount of therapy or medication could have provided. I sleep well every night, knowing that I am watched over by forces that are stronger than any nightmare. And in the morning I wake up grateful for another day of life, another opportunity to grow in faith, another chance to help others who might be struggling with their own battles against darkness. Some nights when the wind is strong and the old building creaks and settles around me, I remember those red eyes staring through Bethany's cabin window. But instead of feeling afraid, I feel grateful. Grateful for the experience that taught me about spiritual warfare. Grateful for Bethany's friendship and guidance. And most of all, grateful for the protection that surrounds me now and always. The darkness is still out there, still seeking those it can devour, but it has no power over those who walk in the light, who call upon divine protection, who understand that faith is not just a comfort but a weapon against the forces that would destroy us. I am no longer afraid because I am no longer alone, and that makes all the difference in the world. The woods have always been my sanctuary. For as long as I can remember, I've found solace among the trees, their quiet presence a balm for my troubled mind. But on that fateful day in 1996, the forest's familiar embrace turned into something far more sinister, forever changing my perception of the world around me. I had returned from a tour in Bosnia about a year earlier, and to say I was struggling to readjust would be an understatement. The horrors I'd witnessed, the things I'd done, they clung to me like a second skin, impossible to shed. The doctors called it PTSD, but that clinical term failed to capture the essence of my daily struggle. Every mundane task felt like navigating a minefield, each unexpected sound a potential trigger for memories I desperately wanted to forget. Walking became my therapy. I'd lace up my boots and head out, seeking the deepest, most remote trails I could find. My preferred spot was a little-known path off Ridgeway Peak, just north of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It was the kind of place locals avoided, its reputation tainted by whispers of government testing during the Cold War, abandoned missile silos, and clandestine black ops. Most dismiss these stories as baseless conspiracy theories, but I knew better. My time in Bosnia had taught me that the government had secrets they'd kill to protect. I'd been part of missions that left me with more questions than answers. Cleanup operations in areas where locals spoke of unnatural occurrences. The details were always classified, but the body count was real enough. That morning I packed light, just a water bottle, my trusty Swiss Army knife, and an old map I'd gotten from a ranger years ago. The trail wasn't marked on most current maps, which suited me just fine. By noon, I was deep in the heart of the forest, at least 5 or 6 miles from the nearest road. The air was unusually thick and humid for an autumn day in Tennessee, and sweat soaked through my jacket as I pushed on. As I reached a small clearing, something changed. The temperature dropped dramatically, as if I'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. I glanced up, expecting to see cloud cover, but the sky remained clear and blue. An eerie silence descended, absent of even the faintest rustle of leaves or chirp of birds. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I pressed on, approaching a ridge the locals called Disappearing Ridge. The name had always seemed like just another bit of local color, but as I neared the top I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood about 50 yards ahead, tall and dressed in dark clothing, but it was the face, or lack thereof, that truly terrified me. From that distance I couldn't make out any features, just a blank expanse where a face should have been. I blinked, and in that instant the figure vanished. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. A PTSD-induced hallucination? A trick of the light? But deep down, I knew this was different. It felt too real, too present. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the ridge and descend the other side where the dense tree cover would offer some sense of protection. As I crested the ridge, I noticed something else: footprints. They were fresh, leading off the path and into the thick underbrush. The size and depth of the impressions were unsettling. Whoever or whatever had left them was unnaturally heavy. The boot tread sinking deep into the soft earth. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to retreat to the safety of civilization. But a morbid curiosity honed by years of confronting the unexplainable propelled me forward. I followed the tracks, pushing through dense foliage and scrambling over moss-covered rocks. With each step I felt as if I was leaving the world I knew behind, venturing into a realm where the normal rules no longer applied. The forest grew darker, the trees pressing in closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. After what felt like hours of hiking, the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a small ravine. What I saw at the bottom made me question everything I thought I knew about the area's history. Half hidden by overgrown vegetation was a bunker, its rusted metal door slightly ajar. I'd heard rumors of old government facilities in these hills, but seeing one in person was something else entirely. I stood at the edge of the ravine for several long moments, weighing my options. The sensible part of me urged caution, insisted that I should walk away and pretend I'd never seen this place, but my training and experiences had shaped me into someone who couldn't ignore such mysteries. With a deep breath, I began my descent into the ravine. The bunker's entrance loomed before me, a dark maw leading into the unknown. The air that seeped out was stale and carried a faint metallic odor that made me think of old blood. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside, my eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The beam of light revealed a scene straight out of a Cold War nightmare. Rows of rusted filing cabinets lined the walls, their contents long since destroyed by time and the elements. Broken equipment lay scattered across the floor, their purposes now impossible to discern. But it was what stood in the center of the room that truly chilled me to my core. A metal table, not unlike those I'd seen in morgues, dominated the space. What set this one apart were the leather straps attached to its sides, cracked and weathered but unmistakably designed to restrain a person or something else. My mind raced back to those classified missions in Bosnia, to the mangled bodies we'd found, and the vague reports of unidentified hostiles or experimental failures that always followed. I was about to turn and leave when I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, and found myself face to face with the figure from the ridge. Only now, I could see the true horror of its appearance. The face, if you could call it that, was a smooth, featureless expanse. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just blank flesh where features should have been. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. In its hand, the figure clutched a long, wickedly sharp knife that gleamed dully in the beam of my flashlight. I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run. But there was nowhere to go. The ravine was a dead end, and the only exit was behind this nightmarish entity. It took a step toward me, moving with a slow, almost casual gait, as if it had all the time in the world to corner its prey. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the confined space. I gripped my Swiss Army knife tightly, though I knew it would be little use against the creature's larger blade. There was no response, just that blank face and those relentless, measured steps. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this impossible situation. Then I spotted it, an old rusted pipe jutting from the wall, likely part of the bunker's long-defunct ventilation system. Without thinking, I lunged for it, wrenching it free with strength born of desperation. The creature was upon me in an instant. I swung the pipe with all my might, connecting solidly with its head. The impact would have felled any normal man, but this thing barely staggered. It paused for the briefest moment, then lunged forward with frightening speed, its knife slashing through the air. I felt a searing pain as the blade grazed my arm, but adrenaline kept me moving. Dodging another wild swing, I managed to slip past the creature and bolt for the exit. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not daring to look back as I scrambled up the ravine and plunged into the forest. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I pushed on. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but the primal fear of what lurked behind me drove me forward. I had no idea how long I ran, or in what direction. The woods all looked the same in my panic, an endless maze of trees and shadows. Finally, miraculously, I stumbled onto a familiar stretch of trail. I chanced a glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that featureless face emerging from the undergrowth. But there was nothing, just the silent, indifferent forest stretching out behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I sped away from Ridgeway Peak, not slowing down until I was miles away, and the forest was nothing but a dark smudge in my rearview mirror. In the days that followed, I grappled with what I'd experienced. I reported the bunker to the authorities, but they dismissed my concerns. They claimed it was likely just an old Cold War relic, nothing to be worried about. There was no mention of the faceless figure, the knife, or the strange disappearances that had plagued the area for years. It was as if the entire incident was being swept under the rug, buried under layers of bureaucracy and willful ignorance. I never returned to Ridgeway Peak after that day. The woods I once found so comforting now felt tainted, hiding secrets I couldn't begin to comprehend. But the memory of what I encountered there never faded. In quiet moments, I can still feel the weight of that blank gaze upon me, still hear those measured footsteps echoing in the depths of the forest. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It shattered my perception of reality, forcing me to confront the possibility that there are things in this world that defy explanation. The government's denial only strengthened my resolve to uncover the truth, though I knew the path would be dangerous. In the years since, I've dedicated myself to researching similar incidents, reaching out to others who've had encounters they can't explain. I've compiled files, cross-referenced reports, and slowly begun to piece together a picture of something much larger and more terrifying than I could have imagined. There are others out there like the creature I encountered, beings that don't fit into our understanding of the world, and there are people, powerful people, who will go to great lengths to keep their existence hidden. But I won't stop searching for answers. Because I know what I saw that day in the woods was real, and I know that some secrets don't stay buried forever. As I sit here writing this account, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Perhaps it's just paranoia, a lingering effect of that day in the woods. Or perhaps it's something more. All I know is that the world is a far stranger and more dangerous place than most people realize. And somewhere out there, in the depths of forests or the shadows of abandoned bunkers, there are things waiting to be discovered. Things that might be better left hidden. But I can't turn back now. The truth is out there, buried beneath layers of secrecy and denial. And no matter the cost, I'm determined to uncover it. Because some hunts never truly end, and some hunters never stop pursuing their prey. In this case, I'm not sure if I'm the hunter or the hunted. But I do know one thing: the game is far from over. I don't usually talk about what happened. It's not because I don't want to. Believe me, sometimes I think telling the whole story would take the weight off. It's just that most people won't believe me. They'll nod politely, maybe laugh nervously, and then try to change the subject. But after all these years, I've decided I'll say it exactly how it happened. Maybe it'll make sense to someone else. Maybe it won't, but this is what I know. The year was 1985, late September, and I had just turned 28. My name is Jack Harland, and back then I was working a dead-end job at the Tacoma Steelworks on the outskirts of Tacoma, Washington. Every day was the same: the deafening clang of metal on metal, the acrid smell of burning slag, and the monotonous rhythm of machines that seemed to suck the life out of everything around them. I'd come home each night, my clothes reeking of sweat and steel, feeling like I was slowly being crushed under the weight of my own unfulfilled dreams. My only escape was hiking. The mountains, the woods, those were the places I felt truly alive, away from the cold gray walls of my life. I would often take weekends to explore the Cascade Mountains, going deeper and deeper into the wild, testing my limits, pushing myself farther each time. It was during these solitary treks that I felt most like myself, most connected to something greater than the daily grind that threatened to consume me. That fateful weekend was supposed to be like any other. I had heard about this place, Lake Wenichi, from a guy at work named Mike. He was one of those old-timers who seemed to know every hidden gem in the state. "Jack," he said to me one day during our lunch break, his voice low as if he was sharing a secret. "You ever been to Lake Wenichi?" I shook my head, curious. Mike leaned in closer, his eyes glinting with excitement. "It's a hidden gem, I tell ya. Not many people know about it. And it's perfect for camping. Just you in the wilderness. No tourists, no RVs, just pure untouched nature." That sounded like heaven to me. Solitude, peace, a break from everything. I pressed Mike for more details, and he was happy to oblige, sketching out a rough map on a napkin and telling me about the best spots to camp. "Just be careful," he added as an afterthought, his tone suddenly serious. "Nature out there, it's different. Pristine, yeah, but also, I dunno. Just keep your wits about you, okay?" I nodded, not thinking much of his warning at the time. I'd been on plenty of solo hikes before. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness, or so I thought. That Friday, I packed my gear with an excitement I hadn't felt in months. My trusty backpack was filled with all the essentials: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, water purification tablets, first aid kit, and a few other survival items. I also threw in my old Nikon camera, hoping to capture some of the beauty Mike had described. I woke up before dawn on Friday, the anticipation making sleep impossible. The sky was just beginning to lighten as I threw my gear into my beat-up 1972 Ford F-100 pickup. The old truck had seen better days. Its once vibrant blue paint now faded and chipped, but it had never let me down. As I pulled out of my driveway, the familiar rumble of the engine felt like a promise of adventure. The drive was long but scenic. I headed east on Highway 2, watching as the urban sprawl of the Seattle area gradually gave way to smaller towns, then to rolling farmland, and finally to the majestic forests of the Cascades. Endless trees stretched up into the sky, their leaves just starting to turn orange and gold, signaling the onset of fall. The morning mist clung to the valleys, creating an ethereal landscape that seemed to exist outside of time. As I drove, my mind wandered. I thought about my life, about the dreams I'd had when I was younger. I'd always imagined I'd do something more with my life than work in a steel mill. Maybe I'd be a writer or a photographer for National Geographic, capturing the world's hidden wonders. But life has a way of steering you off course, doesn't it? One compromise here, one detour there, and suddenly you're miles away from where you thought you'd be. I shook off these melancholy thoughts as I neared my destination. This weekend was about escaping all that, about reconnecting with the part of myself that still believed in possibility. I reached the trailhead Mike had described by mid-afternoon. The parking lot was little more than a wide spot in the road, with room for maybe a half-dozen cars. There were only a couple of vehicles there when I arrived, an old Jeep Wagoneer and a battered Volkswagen van that looked like it had seen its fair share of adventures. Perfect. I liked it quiet, just me and the mountains. As I got out of my truck, I took a deep breath, savoring the crisp mountain air. It smelled of pine and earth, with a hint of wood smoke from somewhere distant. The forest loomed before me, ancient and mysterious. For a moment I felt a strange sense of unease, as if the trees themselves were watching me. I brushed it off as pre-hike jitters and began to unload my gear. I strapped on my backpack, its familiar weight settling comfortably on my shoulders. I double-checked my map, an old USGS topographic map that Mike had marked up for me, and made sure my compass was easily accessible. With one last look at my truck, I set off down the trail. The hike itself wasn't too difficult, just a steady incline through thick forest. The trail was well maintained at first, but as I went deeper into the woods, it became less defined. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground, making the path harder to follow. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft green glow. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, and I'd whirl around, half expecting to see something. But there was never anything there, just the endless sea of trees and undergrowth. I tried to focus on the beauty around me instead. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. A pair of squirrels chased each other up a massive Douglas fir, chattering angrily. A woodpecker's rhythmic tapping echoed through the trees. Once I even caught a glimpse of a deer, its brown coat blending perfectly with the forest as it bounded away at my approach. As the afternoon wore on, the forest began to change subtly. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways that didn't seem quite natural. The bird songs that had accompanied me earlier faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I checked my map again, frowning. According to Mike's directions, I should be nearing the lake, but all I could see was more forest. Had I taken a wrong turn somewhere? I was about to turn back when I caught a glimmer of water through the trees ahead. Pushing through a dense thicket, I suddenly found myself on the shore of Lake Wenichi. The sight took my breath away. The lake stretched out before me, vast and still, its surface like a mirror reflecting the surrounding mountains and the fading purple sky. The last rays of the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. I stood there for a long moment, drinking in the view. This, I thought, this is why I come out here. In that moment, all the stress and frustration of my daily life seemed to melt away. I felt small in the face of such natural beauty, but also somehow more alive than I had in years. As the light began to fade, I set about making camp. I found a good spot near the shoreline, sheltered by a stand of towering cedars. I pitched my tent with practiced ease, gathered some firewood, and soon had a cheerful blaze going. Sitting by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans and beef jerky, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The night was clear, and as the fire died down, I leaned back to gaze at the stars. Out here, away from the city lights, the sky was a riot of stars, more than I'd ever seen before. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light. That first night was peaceful. The kind of peace you can only find out there, away from people, from noise, from everything. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, the occasional splash of fish jumping in the lake. It was perfect. But that peace wouldn't last long. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the darkness was watching me, waiting. If only I'd known then what I know now, I would have packed up and left right then. But I didn't, and that decision would change my life forever. I woke early the next morning, just as the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the trees. The air was crisp and cool, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I emerged from my tent, I was greeted by a sight that took my breath away. The lake was shrouded in a thick mist, giving it an otherworldly appearance. The surrounding mountains loomed like silent sentinels, their peaks just visible above the fog. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong black coffee, I decided to explore the area around the lake. There were old logging trails that snaked through the woods, some of them barely visible, overgrown with moss and weeds. I chose one that seemed to lead deeper into the forest, away from the lake. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The forest seemed different in the daylight, but not in a comforting way. The trees grew impossibly close together, their branches intertwining in unnatural ways. The undergrowth was dense and tangled, often forcing me to push my way through. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something's not right, but I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was just alone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching me from the shadows between the trees. Around midday, I stumbled across something strange. The trail I had been following opened up into a small clearing, and there, half hidden by a dense thicket, stood an old cabin. It was a decrepit thing, looking like it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were busted out, the door hung crooked on its hinges, and the roof had caved in on one side. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer. There were no signs of recent activity, but the place gave me a bad vibe, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The wooden walls were weathered and gray, covered in a thick layer of moss and lichen. As I approached, I noticed something odd about the ground around the cabin. The grass and weeds grew in strange patterns, forming circles and spirals that didn't seem natural. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct telling me to turn back. But I had come this far, and something compelled me to see what was inside. I pushed open the crooked door, wincing at the loud creak of rusted hinges. The interior of the cabin was mostly empty. Just a few rusted tools and a collapsed table. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the holes in the roof. The floorboards creaked ominously under my feet as I moved further inside. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. On one of the walls there were carvings, deep jagged marks scratched into the wood. At first I couldn't make out what they were, but as my eyes adjusted to the gloom I realized they were symbols. Not the usual graffiti you'd find in abandoned places, but something older, more sinister. They looked like something you'd see in an old book of folklore or occult practices. I traced my fingers over the symbols, feeling the rough edges of the carvings. They seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard a faint whispering, just at the edge of hearing. I jerked my hand back, suddenly aware of how silent the forest had become. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable under the musty odor of the cabin. But as I stood there, it grew stronger, a sickly sweet scent, like rotting meat mixed with something I couldn't identify. It seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards. My heart racing, I backed out of the cabin. I had seen enough. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, half hidden in the tall grass near the cabin, was a small leather-bound book. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. The leather was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it carefully, afraid it might crumble in my hands. The pages were filled with dense, handwritten text in a language I didn't recognize. Interspersed with the writing were more of those strange symbols I had seen carved into the cabin walls. Some of the pages contained crude drawings, misshapen creatures that looked like a nightmarish blend of human and animal. I don't know why I took the book. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe some part of me knew it might be important later. Whatever the reason, I slipped it into my backpack before heading back towards my campsite. The hike back seemed to take longer than it should have. The forest felt different now, more oppressive. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. More than once I found myself taking wrong turns, ending up in unfamiliar clearings or dense thickets. It was as if the forest itself was trying to keep me from leaving. By the time I made it back to my camp, the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon. The lake, which had seemed so peaceful the night before, now looked dark and forbidding. The surface was unnaturally still, not even a ripple disturbing its glassy surface. I built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. as the flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across my campsite. I took out the book I had found. In the firelight, the symbols on its cover seemed to writhe and shift, as if alive. I opened it again, flipping through the pages, trying to make sense of the strange text and disturbing images. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my heart stop. It was a scream, high-pitched and terrified, cutting through the stillness of the night. It seemed to come from somewhere across the lake, in the direction I had hiked earlier that day. The sound echoed across the water, fading into an eerie silence that was somehow worse than the scream itself. I sat there, frozen, straining my ears for any further sound. But there was nothing. Just the crackle of my fire and the pounding of my own heart. I debated what to do. Should I try to find the source of the scream? But it was dark, and I didn't know the area well. Plus, something in my gut told me that whatever had caused that scream was not something I wanted to encounter. I spent a restless night, jumping at every sound, my mind conjuring terrifying scenarios. When dawn finally broke, I made a decision. I needed to leave this place. Something was very wrong here, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what. But as I began to pack up my camp, I realized with growing horror that things were not as I had left them. My backpack, which I was sure I had left inside my tent, was sitting outside, its contents strewn across the ground. And there, in the soft earth around my campsite, were footprints. But they weren't human footprints, nor any animal tracks I recognized. They were weird, like a mix between a man and something else. They were too large to be human, and too defined to be a bear's. What chilled me to the bone was the realization that whatever had made those prints had walked right up to my tent while I slept. The tracks showed that it had stopped right at the entrance, stood there for who knows how long, and then turned back. I felt my stomach twist as I stared at those unnatural footprints. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I should have left right then. Packed up and hiked back to the car, but something kept me there. I don't know if it was curiosity or stupidity, but I stayed. My hands shook as I gathered my scattered belongings, shoving them haphazardly into my backpack. The leather-bound book I'd found at the cabin seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and I hesitated before packing it away. Part of me wanted to leave it behind, to sever any connection with the strangeness I'd encountered, but another part, a part I didn't fully understand, insisted I keep it close. As the morning wore on, I tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for everything. Maybe it was just an animal I'd never encountered before. Maybe the scream was just a bird or some other wildlife. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. That afternoon, driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't shake, I decided to explore the far side of the lake, away from where I had gone the day before. As I hiked along the shore, the air grew thick, almost oppressive. It was like the forest itself was closing in around me, the trees leaning in, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I could feel eyes on me again, that same sensation of being watched. But every time I stopped to look around, I saw nothing but endless trees and undergrowth. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my feet and my own ragged breathing. It was around 3 p.m. when I heard it. A scream, high-pitched and terrified, cutting through the stillness of the woods. It was the same sound I'd heard the night before, but this time it was close, maybe a few hundred yards away. My blood ran cold, and for a moment I couldn't move. Then, without thinking, I ran toward the sound. My heart pounded in my chest, and branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I burst into a clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. In the middle of the clearing lay a body. A man, face down in the dirt, his clothes torn to shreds. I approached cautiously, my whole body trembling. I knelt down, steeling myself as I rolled him over. His face, I'll never forget his face. It was twisted in horror. Eyes wide open, mouth frozen mid-scream. But it wasn't just the expression that haunted me. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with strange vein-like markings spreading across his face and neck. Whatever had done this wasn't human. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave. But as I turned to run, I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the shadows of the trees, something stood watching me. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body lanky and distorted, like it didn't quite belong in this world. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, they glowed. An unnatural, sickly yellow fixed on me with a predatory intensity. It didn't move. It just watched. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but then something inside me snapped, and I bolted. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the trees, branches slashing at my face and arms. I didn't stop until I reached the lake. I didn't go back to camp. I didn't grab my gear. I just kept running, following the shoreline until I found the trail back to the parking lot. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my heart pounding in my chest, my lungs burning. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back at the forest. For a split second, I thought I saw a pale figure standing between the trees, those yellow eyes gleaming in the shadows. But when I blinked, it was gone. I drove straight to the nearest town, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I went directly to the sheriff's office, burst through the door and spilled out my story in a frantic jumble of words. I told them everything about the cabin, the footprints, the body, the creature. The sheriff, a weathered man named Jim Hawkins, listened patiently, his face impassive. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Son," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I've been sheriff in these parts for nigh on 30 years. I've heard all sorts of stories about those woods. Strange lights, weird sounds, people gone missing, but I've never found anything to back up those tales." I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Now, I'm not saying I don't believe you saw something out there. These woods, they can play tricks on a man's mind, especially when you're out there alone. But a body? A monster? That's a serious claim. We'll send a team out to investigate, but I wouldn't get your hopes up." I could tell from his tone that he didn't believe me. Not really. They'd go through the motions, maybe send a couple of deputies to poke around the lake, but they wouldn't find anything. Whatever was out there, it was too smart, too otherworldly to leave evidence for the local police to find. I never went back to that lake. I never went hiking again. The memory of what I saw that day, of those glowing yellow eyes watching me from the shadows, haunted my dreams for years. A few months later, I heard about a couple of hikers who went missing in the same area. Their bodies were never found. The sheriff chalked it up to accidents, maybe a bear attack, but I knew better. Whatever I saw that day, whatever killed that man, it was still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for its next victim. I left Tacoma not long after that. Couldn't stand to be so close to those mountains anymore. I moved east, tried to start a new life, but the memories followed me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the echo of that inhuman scream ringing in my ears. It wasn't until years later that I finally worked up the courage to open that leather-bound book again. I'd kept it all this time, hidden away in the back of my closet. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, I began to understand bits and pieces of the text. It spoke of ancient beings, older than humanity, that slumbered in the deep places of the world. It talked about rituals to awaken them, to harness their power, and it warned of the consequences. I realized then that what I had encountered in those woods was just the tip of the iceberg. There were things out there, ancient and powerful, that defied our understanding of the world. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you might just stumble upon them. So yeah, I don't tell this story often. Most people don't believe me, and I don't blame them. It's easier to dismiss it as the ramblings of a madman than to accept that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that challenge everything we think we know. But if you ever find yourself near Lake Wenichi, do yourself a favor. Stay away from the far side of the lake. Don't go looking for that cabin. And if you hear a scream echoing through the trees, run. Run as fast as you can, because once you see what I saw, once it knows you're there, it won't stop until it gets what it wants. And trust me, you don't want to know what that is. It's been almost 40 years since that fateful weekend at Lake Wenichi, but the memories haven't faded. If anything, they've grown sharper, more vivid with time. I'm an old man now, my hair gray, my hands not as steady as they once were. But my mind is as clear as ever, especially when it comes to those 3 days in September 9th. I've spent decades trying to make sense of what happened, to find some explanation that fits within the bounds of what we consider normal. I've read countless books on local legends, on cryptozoology, on the occult. I've reached out to experts in fields ranging from biology to parapsychology, but nothing quite fits. Nothing explains what I saw in those woods. The leather-bound book I took from the cabin has been both a blessing and a curse. Over the years, I've managed to decipher more of its contents, though much of it remains a mystery. It speaks of things that shake the very foundations of what I thought I knew about the world. Ancient beings, older than time itself, slumbering in the dark places of the earth. Rituals and sacrifices to awaken them, to harness their terrible power. But for every answer the book provides, it raises a dozen more questions. Who wrote it? How did they come by this knowledge? And why was it left in that dilapidated cabin in the middle of nowhere? I've thought about turning the book over to authorities, to scientists who might be able to make more sense of it. But every time I consider it, I'm held back by a deep-seated fear. What if it falls into the wrong hands? What if someone tries to use the knowledge it contains? The consequences could be catastrophic. So I keep it hidden, locked away where no one else can find it. It's my burden to bear, I suppose. My penance for stumbling into something I never should have seen. I've tried to move on with my life, to put the past behind me. I left Tacoma, moved across the country, started a new career. I even got married, had kids. But the shadow of what happened at Lake Wenichi has always loomed over me. My wife, ex-wife now, she tried to understand, but how could she? How could anyone who wasn't there that day? Over the years, I've kept tabs on the area around Lake Wenichi. I've collected newspaper clippings, police reports, anything I can find about strange occurrences in those woods. The missing hikers I heard about shortly after my experience weren't the last. Every few years, someone else disappears. Sometimes they're found, confused and disoriented, with no memory of where they've been. Sometimes they're never seen again. The official explanations are always the same. People get lost in the woods all the time. Wild animals, accidents. But I know better. I know what's really out there. I've thought about going back, facing my fears, confronting whatever it is that lurks in those woods. But every time I consider it, I see those glowing yellow eyes in my mind, and I know I can't. I'm not the young man I once was. If I couldn't outrun it then, I certainly can't now. So I do the only thing I can. I warn people. I tell my story to anyone who will listen, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I can prevent someone else from stumbling into the same nightmare I did. Most people don't believe me, of course. They smile politely, maybe humor the old man for a while, but I can see it in their eyes. They think I'm crazy, or senile, or both. But every once in a while, I see a flicker of recognition in someone's eyes, a hint of fear, quickly masked. And I wonder, have they seen it too? Are there others out there who have encountered the things that lurk in the shadows of Lake Wenichi? I may never know the full truth of what happened to me all those years ago. I may never understand the nature of the creature I saw, or the significance of the symbols in that old cabin. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced, and I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. So if you're ever in the Pacific Northwest, if you ever find yourself drawn to the pristine waters of Lake Wenichi, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the most beautiful places hide the darkest secrets. And if you hear a scream echoing through the trees, if you feel eyes watching you from the shadows, don't hesitate. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because once you've seen what's out there, once it knows you're aware of its existence, it will never stop hunting you. And trust me, there are some things in this world that are better left undiscovered. As for me, I'm an old man now. My adventuring days are long behind me. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself back in those woods. I feel the oppressive silence, smell the dank odor of that old cabin, see those terrifying yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, and I wonder, is it still out there? Is it waiting? And what will happen when there's no one left who remembers, no one left to warn others of the danger? I suppose in the end that's why I'm finally telling this story in full. Not because I expect you to believe me, but because I hope that maybe, just maybe, it might save someone else from the fate I narrowly escaped. Because the truth is out there, hidden in the shadows of Lake Wenichi, and sometimes the truth is more terrifying than we could ever imagine. The fluorescent lights of the office buzzed faintly overhead as I finished up my work for the day. It was Friday, and the clock on my computer screen read 6:47 p.m. Most of my coworkers had already left, eager to start their weekends. I stretched, feeling the satisfying pop in my back after hours of hunching over my keyboard. As I was packing up my bag, my phone started vibrating insistently on the desk. I glanced at the screen, surprised to see Hank's name flashing. Hank and I had been best friends since college, but he usually texted rather than called. A twinge of concern flickered through me as I answered, "Hey Hank, what's up?" Instead of Hank's usual cheerful greeting, I was met with heavy breathing and the sound of rustling leaves. When he finally spoke, his voice was tense and slightly breathless. "Mike, thank God you picked up. I need your help. Something's happened." I frowned, my hand pausing as I was zipping up my laptop bag. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm at Buckner Forest Preserve," Hank replied, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I came out for a hike after work to clear my head, you know? But I found something really messed up. I called the police, but they think I'm pulling some sick prank. They won't listen." My stomach tightened at the panic in his voice. Hank wasn't the type to get worked up over nothing. "Slow down," I said, trying to keep my own voice calm. "What did you find?" There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of Hank's ragged breathing. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "A body, Mike. I found a body. And Jesus, it's not like anything I've ever seen before. This wasn't an accident or an animal attack. Someone or something did this on purpose." A chill ran down my spine. "Hank, are you sure? Maybe it's—" "I'm sure," he cut me off, his voice hardening. "I know what I saw. Will you come out here, please? I don't know what to do, and I don't want to be alone out here." I glanced at my watch, then out the window at the fading daylight. Every instinct told me this was a bad idea, that I should tell Hank to get out of there and meet me somewhere safe. But the fear in my friend's voice overrode my reservations. "Okay," I said, already heading for the elevator. "Text me your exact location. I'm on my way." As I drove toward Buckner Forest Preserve, my mind raced with possibilities. Maybe Hank had stumbled upon a horrific crime scene. Or maybe I tried to reassure myself. This was all some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps he'd found an animal carcass in the dim light, and his imagination had run wild. The preserve was about a 40-minute drive from my office in Chicago. As I left the city behind, the buildings gave way to suburbs, and then to stretches of farmland interspersed with patches of forest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks that seemed at odds with the growing sense of dread in my chest. I turned off the main highway onto a smaller road that wound through dense woods. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches reaching over the pavement like grasping fingers. As darkness fell, I flicked on my high beams, the bright light cutting through the gloom ahead. Finally, I spotted Hank's blue Subaru parked at a small trailhead pullout. I pulled in beside it, noticing with unease that his was the only other vehicle there. Grabbing my phone and a flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out into the chilly evening air. "Hank," I called out, sweeping my flashlight beam across the tree line. "Where are you?" "Over here." His voice came from somewhere to my left, farther down the trail. "Follow the path. I'll flash my light so you can see me." I saw a beam of light flicker between the trees about 100 yards away. Taking a deep breath, I started down the narrow dirt trail, leaves crunching beneath my feet. The woods seemed to close in around me, the darkness beyond my flashlight beam almost palpable. Every rustle and snap made me jump, imagining eyes watching me from the shadows. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I rounded a bend and saw Hank. He was standing near the base of a large oak tree, his own flashlight clutched tightly in his hand. As I approached, the beam of light illuminated his face, and I was struck by how pale and drawn he looked. "Mike," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Thanks for coming. I'm sorry to drag you out here, but I didn't know what else to do." I clasped his shoulder, trying to offer some reassurance. "It's okay. I'm here now. Tell me what's going on." Hank ran a shaky hand through his hair. "I was just trying to clear my head after a rough day at work, you know. I've hiked out here plenty of times before, but I went off the main trail, wanting to explore a bit. That's when I found it." He gestured vaguely deeper into the woods. "It's about a quarter mile that way. I can show you, but are you sure you want to see it? It's pretty bad." I hesitated, a part of me wanting nothing more than to grab Hank and get the hell out of there. but I knew I couldn't leave without understanding what had shaken my friend so badly. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Show me." Hank nodded grimly and started leading the way, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the forest floor. We pushed through dense underbrush, the branches seeming to claw at our clothes. The air grew colder and damper as we moved deeper into the woods, and an oppressive silence settled around us, broken only by our labored breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath our feet. Finally, Hank came to a stop in a small clearing. "There," he said quietly, pointing his flashlight beam toward the base of a gnarled old tree. I followed the light, my eyes struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. At first it looked like a tangle of roots and debris, but as I stepped closer, horror washed over me as I realized what I was looking at. It was a body, or what remained of one. The corpse was twisted and contorted in ways that defied human anatomy, limbs bent at impossible angles. But that wasn't the worst of it. The skin had been, I struggled to find the right word, shredded, peeled. It hung in ragged strips, exposing muscle and sinew beneath. Some of these strips had been woven into the branches of the nearby trees, as if in some grotesque attempt at camouflage. I stumbled backward, my stomach heaving. "Jesus Christ," I gasped, fighting the urge to vomit. What could have done this?" Hank shook his head, his face ashen. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. That's why I called the police, but they wouldn't listen. They thought I was some kid pulling a prank." I forced myself to look at the body again, trying to approach it with some semblance of objectivity. Could it have been an animal attack? A bear, maybe? "No way," Hank said firmly. "Look at how the skin is woven into the trees. No animal does that." This was intentional. A chill ran down my spine as I realized he was right. Whatever had done this wasn't just killing for food or in self-defense. This was something else entirely. "We need to call the police again," I said, pulling out my phone. But as I looked at the screen, my heart sank. No signal out here. Damn it. Hank nodded grimly. "Yeah. I had to hike back to my car to make the call earlier. That's part of why I wanted you to come. I didn't want to leave it unguarded, but I was scared to stay here alone." I understood his fear all too well. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, and the weight of unseen eyes pressed down on us. "Okay," I said, trying to think clearly despite the panic clawing at the edges of my mind. "We need a plan. We can't just leave this here. But we also can't stay out in these woods all night." Hank opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a twig snapped loudly somewhere in the darkness behind us. We both whirled around, our flashlights cutting through the gloom, but revealing nothing but trees and shadows. "Did you hear that?" Hank whispered, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah. It was probably just an animal, right? A deer or something?" But even as I said it, I knew I was trying to convince myself as much as Hank. The forest suddenly seemed alive with menace. Every rustle of leaves and creak of branches a potential threat. "We should get out of here," Hank said, already backing away from the grotesque scene. "Come back in the morning with the police." I was about to agree when something caught my eye. A flash of movement at the edge of my flashlight beam. I swung the light back, illuminating a patch of forest floor about 20 feet away. "Wait," I said, grabbing Hank's arm. "Look at this." In the soft earth, clearly visible in the harsh glare of our flashlights, was a footprint, but it wasn't like any animal track I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own foot, with long, cruel-looking claw marks extending from each toe. Hank's breath caught in his throat. What the hell made that? Before I could answer, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but filled with a primal, predatory malice that sent ice through my veins. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Then, as the growl intensified, I shouted, "Run!" We took off through the woods, all thoughts of caution forgotten in our blind panic. Branches whipped at our faces and roots threatened to trip us with every step, but we pushed on, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. Behind us, I could hear something crashing through the underbrush. Whatever it was big, and it was fast. The sound of splintering wood and tearing foliage grew closer with each passing second. "This way," Hank yelled, veering off to the right. I followed without question, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. We burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and empty. Without a word, we both made for it, praying it would offer some kind of shelter. Hank reached the door first, yanking on the handle. For a heart-stopping moment, it refused to budge. Then, with a groan of protesting wood, it swung open. We tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. "Help me barricade it," I gasped, already shoving an old dusty couch against the door. Hank joined me, and together we piled whatever furniture we could find against the entrance. As we worked, the growling outside grew louder. Something heavy slammed against the side of the cabin, making the whole structure shudder. We froze, staring at each other in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. "What do we do now?" Hank whispered, his eyes wide with fear. I looked around the cabin, searching for anything we could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on an old fireplace poker leaning against the hearth. I grabbed it, feeling slightly less helpless with its solid weight in my hand. "We wait," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Whatever's out there, it can't get in here. We'll wait until morning, then make a run for it." Hank nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew that if the thing outside really wanted to get in, our makeshift barricade wouldn't hold it for long. As if in response to my thoughts, another impact rocked the cabin. This time I heard the distinct sound of wood splintering. A quick glance confirmed my fears. A large crack had appeared in one of the boarded-up windows. "We need a better plan," Hank said, his voice shaking. "We can't just sit here and wait to die." I nodded, my mind racing. Okay, let's think. There has to be something we can do." As we huddled in the darkened cabin, the sounds of our pursuer circling outside, I couldn't help but wonder how we had ended up in this nightmare. What was that thing out there? And more importantly, how were we going to survive the night? The old cabin creaked and groaned around us, its timbers protesting against the assault from outside. Hank and I huddled near the center of the single room, our eyes darting between the boarded-up windows and the barricaded door. Every few minutes a heavy impact would shake the structure, followed by that bone-chilling growl. "We need to find a way to contact someone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's got to be a landline or a radio or something in here." Hank nodded, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boards. "Good idea. You check that side. I'll look over here." We split up, searching the cabin as thoroughly as we could in the near darkness. I rummaged through drawers and cupboards, finding nothing but dust, cobwebs, and the occasional scurrying mouse. The cabin seemed to have been abandoned for years, its contents long since looted or decayed. "Anything?" I called out to Hank. "Nothing useful," he replied, frustration evident in his voice. "Wait, hold on. I think I found something." I made my way over to where Hank was crouched near an old desk. He held up a battered leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "A journal?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. Hank nodded, carefully opening the fragile book. "Yeah, looks like it. Maybe it can tell us something about this place or what's out there." As Hank flipped through the pages, I kept an ear out for any changes in the sounds outside. The creature seemed to have settled into a pattern of circling the cabin, occasionally testing the walls for weakness. I tried not to think about how long our shelter would hold. "Listen to this," Hank said suddenly, his finger tracing a line of faded text. "It's dated about 30 years ago. The sightings are becoming more frequent. The loggers speak of a beast in the woods, something that walks like a man but hunts like no animal they've ever seen. I've tried to warn the Forest Service, but they won't listen. They think it's just superstition, or maybe a bear that's lost its fear of humans. But I know better. I've seen it." A chill ran down my spine. "Keep reading," I urged. Hank turned the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There's more. I finally got a clear look at the creature last night. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, with matted fur covering its body. But its face, God help me, its face was almost human. Its eyes gleamed with an intelligence that no mere animal could possess. I know now that the old legends are true. The Wendigo walks these woods." "Wendigo?" I repeated, the unfamiliar word feeling strange on my tongue. "What the hell is that?" Before Hank could answer, a deafening crash echoed through the cabin. We both jumped, whirling to face the source of the noise. One of the boarded-up windows had given way, planks of wood clattering to the floor. In the gap, illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the trees, we caught our first clear glimpse of our pursuer. It was, as the journal had described, massive. Its body was a nightmarish fusion of human and animal features, with elongated limbs covered in matted dark fur. Its face was a twisted parody of human features, with sunken eyes that glowed with an eerie yellowish light. But what struck me most were its hands. Not paws, but hands, ending in wickedly curved claws that looked capable of tearing through flesh and bone with ease. For a moment we all froze. Hank and I paralyzed with fear, the creature seemingly surprised by its sudden intrusion. Then, with a roar that shook dust from the rafters, it began to force its way through the opening. "The back door!" I yelled, grabbing Hank's arm and yanking him towards the rear of the cabin. We had cleared a path earlier during our search, and now we sprinted for our lives, the sound of splintering wood and inhuman snarls close behind us. We burst out into the cool night air, the forest looming dark and forbidding before us. There was no time to think, no time to plan. We simply ran, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs, driven by pure animal instinct to escape. I could hear the creature pursuing us, its heavy footfalls and occasional roars spurring us to even greater speed. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. Beside me, Hank was gasping for air, his face a mask of terror in the intermittent moonlight that filtered through the canopy. We broke through a thicket into a small clearing, and I skidded to a halt. Ahead of us, the ground dropped away sharply, a cliff face, impossible to climb down in the dark. "This way," Hank yelled, veering to the left along the cliff's edge. I followed, my mind racing. We couldn't keep running forever. We needed a plan, a way to lose our pursuer or fight back. As if in answer to my desperate thoughts, I spotted a dark opening in the cliff face ahead, a cave. "There," I shouted to Hank, pointing. Without hesitation, we made for the cave entrance. We ducked inside, just as the creature burst into the clearing behind us. The cave was pitch black, and we pressed ourselves against the cool stone walls, trying to quiet our labored breathing. Outside, we could hear the Wendigo sniffing the air, its growls echoing off the cliff face. "What do we do now?" Hank whispered, his voice barely audible. I fumbled in my pocket, relieved to find my phone still there. The screen illuminated, casting a faint blue glow around us. No signal, of course, but at least we had some light. I switched on the flashlight function, careful to point it away from the cave entrance. The beam revealed a narrow passage leading deeper into the earth. Rough-hewn steps descended into darkness. "We can't stay here," I said, gesturing towards the passage. "It'll find us for sure. Maybe we can lose it in there." Hank nodded grimly, and we started down the steps, moving as quietly as we could. The sounds of the creature outside grew fainter as we descended, replaced by the drip of water and the echo of our footsteps. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the passage opened up into a larger cavern. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling, giving the unsettling impression that we were standing on the edge of an abyss. "Look," Hank said, pointing. On the far side of the cavern, barely visible in the gloom, was what looked like a man-made structure, a stone archway, carved with intricate symbols. We approached cautiously. The symbols were like nothing I'd ever seen before, a mix of angular lines and curves that seemed to shift and move if I looked at them too long. "What is this place?" I wondered aloud. Hank ran his hand over the carved stone. "Some kind of old mining operation, maybe? Or," he hesitated, "something older." A low rumble from above made us both freeze. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling. The Wendigo had found the cave entrance. "We need to keep moving," I said urgently. Beyond the archway, the passage continued, sloping gently downward. We hurried through the arch, and I felt a strange tingling sensation as we passed under it, like static electricity dancing across my skin. Behind us, the rumbling grew louder, punctuated by the creature's roars. The passage twisted and turned, leading us deeper underground. We passed more carved symbols on the walls, and occasionally glimpsed side chambers filled with strange, half-glimpsed shapes that I tried not to look at too closely. Finally, we emerged into another large cavern. This one was dimly lit by an eerie greenish glow emanating from pools of still water scattered around the chamber. In the center stood a raised stone dais, upon which rested a pedestal holding something. From this distance, in the poor light, I couldn't make out what it was. "What the hell?" Hank muttered, voicing my own confusion. Before we could investigate further, a deafening roar echoed through the cavern. We spun around to see the Wendigo framed in the passage we had just exited, its eyes gleaming with malevolent hunger. "Run!" I yelled, though there was nowhere left to run to. We sprinted for the dais, hoping to put some obstacle between us and the creature. As we reached the pedestal, I finally got a clear look at what it held. A knife, its blade made of some dark stone that seemed to drink in what little light there was. Without thinking, driven by desperation, I grabbed it. The moment my hand closed around the hilt, a jolt of energy surged through me. The symbols carved into the blade began to glow with the same greenish light as the pools, and I felt a presence in my mind. Ancient, alien, but undeniably powerful. The Wendigo charged, covering the distance between us with terrifying speed. But as it reached the edge of the dais, it suddenly recoiled, as if it had struck an invisible barrier. Knowledge flooded into my mind. Snippets of an alien language. Rituals performed in this very cavern millennia ago. The true nature of the creature we faced. I knew, somehow, that this knife was the key to defeating it. "Hank," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "I need you to trust me. When I tell you to, push that thing off the dais." He looked at me like I was insane, but nodded. The Wendigo circled us, probing the invisible barrier, searching for weakness. I raised the knife, the words of a chant I had never learned spilling from my lips. The glow from the blade intensified, and I felt power building around us. The barrier flickered. "Now!" I shouted. As Hank shoved the creature back, I brought the knife down in a gleaming arc. It bit deep into the Wendigo's chest, and an unearthly howl filled the cavern. Green fire erupted from the wound, spreading rapidly across the creature's body. In moments it was over. Where the Wendigo had stood, there was nothing but a pile of ashes, quickly dissipating in a non-existent wind. Hank and I stood there panting, trying to process what had just happened. The knife in my hand grew cold, the glow fading along with the alien presence in my mind. Is it over?" Hank asked hesitantly. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. "I think so, but we need to get out of here, and we need to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." We made our way back through the tunnels, emerging into the pre-dawn light. As we hiked back towards our cars, exhausted and shell-shocked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled into something much bigger than we realized. The Wendigo was gone, but I had a sinking feeling that it was just the tip of a very large, very dangerous iceberg. One thing was certain: our lives would never be the same again. And somehow I knew this was just the beginning of a much larger story. In the weeks that followed our harrowing night in Buckner Forest, Hank and I tried to return to our normal lives, but the memory of what we had experienced and what we had learned haunted us. We made an anonymous tip to the police about the body we had found, but by the time they investigated, all traces of the gruesome scene had vanished. The official report chalked it up to a hoax or a case of overactive imaginations. I kept the stone knife hidden away, unable to bring myself to get rid of it but afraid of its power. Sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard it whispering to me, hinting at other creatures lurking in the dark corners of the world, waiting to be unleashed. Hank threw himself into research, digging into old legends and folklore, trying to find any information he could about the Wendigo and other mythical beasts. He started a blog, ostensibly about cryptozoology, but really a veiled attempt to warn others about what might be out there. As for me, I found myself unable to look at the forests around Chicago the same way. Every shadow held potential threats, every unexplained sound a possible harbinger of terror. But along with the fear came a sense of purpose. We had faced something inhuman and survived. We had protected others from a threat they never knew existed. And deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The knife was proof that there were forces at work in the world far beyond our understanding. Forces that sometimes needed to be confronted by ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Whatever came next, whatever other horrors lurked in the darkness, I knew that Hank and I would face them together. We had been changed by our experience, forged into something new. We were no longer just two friends from Chicago.